All right, hi guys. Let's talk about doing pressure unit conversions. So, like any measurement in science, pressure has a lot of different units we could use to measure it, and sometimes we have to convert between them. First, let's talk about the one we're going to use the most often, and it's probably atmospheres. So, we'll start with one atmosphere and we'll compare everything else to that. And an atmosphere of pressure is reference to the air pressure at sea level. So the air pressure at sea level is roughly one atmosphere. So that unit atmosphere, and the unit we're going to see a lot is millimeters of mercury. So one atmosphere is equal to 760 millimeters of mercury. And it turns out that millimeters of mercury and torr are the same thing. Um, Torr is just named after Torricelli. He's this physicist who had like a third story apartment and he wanted to get water up to his bathtub in his third story apartment. And this is before electricity. So he had to use one of those manual pumps, which essentially works like a straw. It creates a vacuum. And as you learn from the world's longest straw, water can only go so high, 10.3 meters. So he couldn't get the water all the way up into his third story apartment, even if he could create a perfect vacuum at the top. But he thought that was interesting. So he installed a glass tube where the water comes up, and he could see that the water level would fluctuate depending on the weather. So he was someone who actually first noticed differences in atmospheric pressure according to what the weather is doing, which is pretty important. So that's why the unit is named after him, Torricelli. And we also use the unit millimeters of mercury. You saw this picture in the world's longest straw video where we use what's called a manometer, and the air pressure can push mercury up a U-tube to tell us what the pressure is based on the difference in the millimeters that the mercury is pushed up. And we use mercury instead of water because the atmosphere pushes water up 10.3 meters. That's, if it was a vacuum, it'd be 10.3 meters. That's a lot. And so we don't want to have a 10.3 meter manometer, whereas mercury is very dense. So it takes a lot more to push it just a little bit, whereas water is not that dense. So you push it a little bit, it goes way up. So we don't want a 10-meter tall manometer. So that's why we use mercury, because mercury is a super dense liquid. And that's why we use the unit millimeter of mercury. So a little bit of chemistry history there. So another one we use a lot is kilopascals, or kPa. So this is also equal to 101.3 kilopascals. And the last one I'm going to give you is one we don't talk about, and we're going to convert out of it as soon as possible. That is our imperial unit, PSI. And that is equal to 14.7. So I run off the page here. But 14.7 PSI. PSI stands for pounds per square inch, which there's just so many words in that I don't like. Just it all sounds like garbage. We do not like imperial units, so we're going to convert out of that one as soon as humanly possible. But we are mostly going to stick with atmospheres, sometimes millimeters of mercury. Occasionally we'll see a kilopascal kPa. We're mostly sticking with atmospheres. So let's do an example where you would have to convert, let's say, PSI. So we have 32 PSI, and I want to convert that to atmospheres. Well, I have 32 PSI. That's what I start with. If I use my dimensional analysis, I know I need PSI on the bottom and atmospheres on the top. And I know from over here that 14.7 PSI is equal to 1 atmosphere. So I have really, really quickly set up my conversion. I can put that in my calculator and solve my problems. I'm just going to give you the setup. I'll let you do the calculation on your own. Same thing, say I wanted to go, let's go PSI to millimeters of mercury. So let's say I want to go 32 PSI to millimeters of mercury. I know there is 14.7 PSI for 760 millimeters of mercury. So I'm just getting a little crooked here. So it doesn't have to be a 1 associated with it. I'm just using the numbers here in my conversion, and I'll give you this chart along with your practice so you can see what the conversion rates are. And again, I just put this in my calculator, though I would be careful whenever I have a fraction to keep that in parentheses, just so you don't mess up any order of operations. For this one, it doesn't matter too much. If you start getting lots of fractions, you might run into some issues. So always safe to put your fractions in parentheses in your calculator. And that's very easily how you convert units or pressure.